For decades, many American and European foreign policy experts were very worried about Russia's reaction to any of its neighboring countries joining NATO. We now know much more than we have ever known about how Vladimir Putin really reacts when seriously threatened. Yale history professor Timothy Snyder has been an invaluable contributor to our understanding of Russia and Ukraine on this program. Professor Snyder is traveling in Europe, and he sent us some of his thoughts on the possibility of Ukraine joining NATO.
We now know what happens when Putin, the Kremlin, Moscow is under threat. We now know that what they do is de-escalate. This has been true throughout the war. It's actually been true throughout Putin's entire regime. But we saw it quite clearly and quite graphically when Russian troops, Russian mercenaries were on their way to Moscow. What did Putin do? How did he react? How did he react when there was an actual threat to his actual regime and his actual person? He got on a plane. He went to another Russian city. He visited a yacht. He probably cut some checks. He certainly cut a deal. That's what he did. He didn't escalate. He radically de-escalated. He tried threats. When the threats didn't work, he made a deal. I think we need to keep that in mind when we think about the consequences of NATO expansion, because there's nothing that NATO can do. There's nothing that Ukraine can do that will be anywhere near as threatening as what already happened to Putin. It's worth mentioning, reminding ourselves, remembering those origins, because if we remember those origins, we remember that NATO is not about taking something which is perfect and keeping it so. It's about taking the center of Europe, a place where there are risks, and reducing those risks by providing for common security. I think that's the spirit in which one should be thinking and in which one should be acting at this time. One can't think about NATO as an institution which is there to keep a perfectly stable situation perfectly stable. That's not what it was about. That's never what it was about. NATO was always about taking a situation which was risky and making it less so. NATO has always had to operate in imperfect conditions. When NATO was founded, it was founded at a time when Germany was divided. The most important member of NATO, except the United States, was actually West Germany, the Federal Republic of Germany, a country which was divided, a country which had a claim on a good deal of territory that didn't control.
Ben Rhodes is back with us. Ben Rhodes, what was your reaction to what Professor Snyder had to say?
Well, there's a lot there. I think, first of all, one of the points about Putin de-escalating, that's very important. And what I'd add to that is Putin's case, and some of the people that have been concerned about this effort, has been that time is on his side, that the longer this goes on, the more there's dysfunction in the West, the more he kind of waits people out. What we saw with Prigozhin is that maybe time is not working for Vladimir Putin, it's working against him. It is opening up cracks in his own regime. And in that case, it seemed like there was a physical threat on Moscow itself. And so in addition to showing us that he de-escalated to save his own skin, it also showed him that time is not necessarily on his side. I think what we have to bear in mind is the most important thing we can do is take care of our own business in the United States. Lawrence, we just talked about Joe Biden's accomplishments. Well, the elephant in the room is Donald Trump, who would come in and try to wreck it all, who might even try to take the United States out of NATO, right? That's what's at stake in this election. That's probably what Putin is waiting for. And so I think Professor Snyder is right that we have to have a vision for NATO that includes, in the very long run, Ukraine. I think Joe Biden is wise to not take that step yet because they're in a war and we can't make good on a collective defense assurance when they're in an active war. But we have to remember that if we take care of our own business, we're stronger than Russia. And Putin is weak and he is on the back foot and time is not on his side.
We have learned a lot since his invasion of Ukraine about Vladimir Putin. At the same time, we learned a lot about President Zelensky and his strength. But what we've been learning is the weakness of Vladimir Putin and that he has no success plan.
He has no plan for what he's doing in Ukraine because he thought that they would fold. And when they didn't, he didn't have a plan B. He also does not have a functioning state. It's a kleptocracy that he sits on top of with some competing fiefdoms underneath him, all of whom are just as corrupt as he is, right? And so there's a fundamental weakness, a rot at the core of the Putin regime that has been exposed by this war. It doesn't mean that it's not dangerous. It doesn't mean that every day that goes on is not a human tragedy, above all for the people in Ukraine. It doesn't mean that we shouldn't be concerned about the risk of nuclear escalation. I think what Professor Snyder reminds us, though, is that we control our own destiny. NATO determines what we're going to do. NATO determines what kinds of support we're going to provide to the Ukrainians. Joe Biden has been very careful to calibrate that support to test how Putin would respond. And what we've seen is the Biden administration has clearly calculated at each juncture that we can push a little more and we can provide a little bit more assistance. Personally, I agree with that calibrated approach, because when it comes to things like nuclear weapons, you can't get it wrong. But we've definitely seen the West get stronger and Putin get weaker.